Israel called it Operation Roaring Lion. The United States called it Operation Epic Fury. Whatever the name, today's attack could forever change the Middle East and risks a forever war of the kind Donald Trump had vowed to end. It began with American and Israeli strikes targeting government buildings in Iran's capital, Tehran, including the supreme leader's compound, as well as sites across western Iran, including Karaj, Qom, Isfahan, Shiraz and Kermanshah. Donald Trump's threat to take out the Iranian Navy was backed by explosions heard in the southern port cities of Bushehr and Chabahar. Iranian media said a girls' school was hit in the southern city of Minab, killing dozens. Iran hit back quickly at Israel, triggering air defences and sirens across the country. It also appears to have closed the vital Strait of Hormuz and says it fired missiles at all the American bases in the Gulf, including in Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Jordan. So far, one casualty has been confirmed from falling debris in Abu Dhabi. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, now reports.
"Mum, leave the house immediately," she shouts down the phone. Panic on the streets of Tehran this morning as the first US and Israeli missiles landed. Disaster or deliverance? After weeks of tension, they couldn't believe their eyes and ears. The US justified the assault, saying a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic is a threat to the whole world.
For these reasons, the United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated.
Target number one, the compound of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, destroyed. The Israelis are reported to believe that he was likely killed, although neither the Americans nor the Iranians have as yet provided confirmation.
Almost all officials are safe and sound and alive. We may have lost one or two commanders, but that is not a big problem.
The ruins of a school in the southern town of Minab, allegedly hit by either an Israeli or an American strike. The Iranian government says dozens of children were killed. It's unclear whether the school was a target or hit by a stray missile. Revolutionary Guard targets were struck all over the country, as the Israeli Prime Minister suggested that the attacks were to support the people of Iran.
Help has arrived.
And I believe the day is near when Israel and a free Iran will hold hands in favor of security and peace, in favor of progress and prosperity.
Iran hit back immediately, targeting the US naval base in Bahrain, as well as US facilities and other targets in another 7 countries across the region. After the UAE and Jordan were hit, Saudi Arabia condemned Iran's blatant aggression in a strong statement, indicating that Gulf countries are supporting the US and Israel. An Iranian missile hit Kuwait airport, and planes have been grounded indefinitely across the region. Sirens sounded across Israel as people sought shelter, expecting attacks. Iran said it had blocked the Straits of Hormuz, the shipping lane which handles some 20% of the world's oil.
Trump should know that today we are equipped with the most advanced capabilities to fight you for years. At the start of the war, we are firing whatever we have at the bottom of our stockpile. But as it continues, we will use our most powerful missiles, the things we have not revealed until now, the ones we have kept under wraps, we will also bring out in the coming days.
The regime brought out a few supporters onto the streets, trying to show that it fears nothing. But the Americans are hoping that somehow their air campaign can persuade Iranians who protested against the regime last month and were killed in their thousands to rise up again.
Finally, to the great proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. Stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
And it seems that some, at least, are listening. A Tehran resident sent us this voice message. We're disguising his identity.
U.S. President Donald Trump asked people to stay inside until they are finished with bombing the targets. He underlined that it is dangerous to go out. So a lot of people are listening to that, waiting for the bombings to be over and then take further measures.
After nightfall, Iran struck a high-rise in Bahrain. And this on the Fairmont Dubai Palm Hotel. Dubai, which prides itself on the wealth and stability it offers its citizens and foreigners. Now the front line in a war between the US and Iran, a war that threatens to engulf the whole region with unknown and almost certainly unintended consequences.
Well, let's get more now from our US editor, Anushka Astana in Washington. Anushka, what is Trump's motivation here and how risky is all of this?
Well, I think if you listen to his words overnight, it sounds like the most sweeping motivation you can imagine, with an end game of regime change. But also listening to him in recent weeks talking about Iran, he has been more focused than that, more narrow on the idea of taking out Iran's nuclear capabilities. In some ways, I think the president has been a little bit drunk on the perceived military success in Venezuela. And you can even hear that in the title of this, Operation Epic Fury, the tone I think that he wants to put out there. That said, presidents in the White House have for decades been discussing how to deal with the Iranian threat. I was speaking to someone this morning who sat through those conversations in the Biden and the Obama years. She said to me that back in 2003, many people thought George W. Bush went for the wrong country, Iraq instead of Iran. But she also explained why they didn't go there. They saw it as very high risk, not just because of the size of Iran, but also because of the structure of the regime, the layers, its desire to survive. And also, America wasn't seen as the right change maker because of its history. Now, speaking to another former negotiator, Aaron David Miller, this morning, he thinks that Trump has been told time and again that things will escalate if he strikes Iran, but when it happened, that wasn't the result. And that may be why he has pushed ahead this time. But Miller also warned that if the end game really is regime change, then there is going to have to be more than this, and perhaps even a ground game, which we know Trump's supporters do not want.
And why do this in the middle of nuclear talks?
Well, I think that is quite a difficult situation that they've got themselves into. The White House sees Arab countries as very, very important partners, and they have upset them with this operation overnight. The Omanis were mediating those talks, and actually we've seen this from the Omani foreign minister. He has put on X, "I am dismayed. Active and serious negotiations have yet again been undermined. Neither the interests of the United States nor the cause of global peace are well served by this, and I pray for the innocents who will suffer. I urge the United States not to get sucked in further. This is not your war." There is also a risk America won't be trusted on negotiations, although the Iranian response on talking about a possible deal means the White House might see this as the ultimate gunboat diplomacy.
In the run-up to the Iraq war, the case was made over many weeks and there was a UN resolution. How has Trump gone about making the case for this?
I mean, I think there are some echoes of that, talking about the idea that there may be missiles that could actually hit the US, and also that the nuclear capabilities could see a bomb made within days. I mean, if you listen to the people who are monitoring the situation in Iran, they don't seem to suggest that those things are realistic. That said, Iranian motivations aren't necessarily to be trusted.
Anushka, thanks very much for joining us. Well, in the last few minutes, Iranian media has said that 201 people have been killed in the strikes, with a further 747 injured. Joining me now is Ken Pollock, former Gulf military analyst at the CIA, who's served on the US National Security Council and is now Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute. Ken Pollock, was there an imminent threat, as Donald Trump put it, and therefore was there any kind of legal justification for this war?
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to answer a legal question. What I will simply say is, no, Iran did not pose an imminent threat, certainly not to the United States, certainly not to the United States homeland. President Trump's justification for this, I think we saw part of it in his speech last night, but I suspect that we'll hear more from other administration officials over the course of the weeks. And yeah, to a point that Anushka made, if you weren't happy about the run-up to the Iraq War, this one seems this one is going to make that one seem well thought out, well planned, and carefully prepared by comparison.
Yeah, and I mean, I know you helped make the case for the Iraq War, but, you know, then there was the UN process, there was a US congressional approval. This time, nothing, none of that. Correct.
Yes, as I said, that time, at least President Bush did go to the Congress. He went to the people any number of times. Some of the statements were misleading. Some of them were simply wrong, but innocently so. But there was a year-long campaign to try to make the case, and the Bush administration did in a very ham-fisted way, but did try to bring other countries on board. This seems to have been rushed quite a bit more. And I think one of the great questions out there, Kathy, is whether President Trump had been planning a regime change campaign all along, or whether he suddenly came to this on the spur of the moment. You know, he has said he goes by his gut, and he often makes decisions, based on something that just happened. We'll have to find out.
So in a way, this is really potentially a war, potentially a very protracted war, of questionable legality. I accept what you're saying, you're not an attorney, but this is on the whim of one man. Is there anything that can be done to sort of rein him in at any point?
Well, unfortunately, the United States does have three different arms of government. Our judiciary has given it a pretty good shot and done a little bit. But, at the end of the day, the real check on the President of the United States was meant to be our Congress, which has been supine since he returned to office, and truthfully has been, as two of my friends said in a great book that they once wrote, the broken branch for the last 2 or 3 decades.
And you talked of regime change, and that does seem to be Donald Trump's aim here. Is it doable from the air, or is there going to be the need for a ground campaign with all the fallout that entails?
Yeah, so this is, of course, the $64 trillion question. It's very difficult to change a regime from the air. Most of the time it fails, and countries have been trying for 80 years, let's remember. Typically, when it succeeds, there is some kind of a ground component. Perhaps the closest analogy we can come to this is, of course, the joint NATO operation against Libya in 2011. But even in Libya, there was a huge protest movement in which large numbers of Libyan military personnel were already participating. And so the NATO air forces were largely adding an air component to that. In this case, we don't see any of that. And I think that even if it somehow succeeded, and of course, new technology, new capabilities, it might succeed in bringing down this regime, but then you get into the next problem of it might bring down this regime and it might lead to chaos afterwards.
Ken Pollock, thank you very much for joining us. Now, it was Israel that first confirmed bombing was underway early this morning when it announced what it called a preemptive attack on Iran. According to the Israeli military, 200 fighter jets attacked 500 targets. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the attack would, quote, allow the brave Iranian people to rid themselves of their murderous regime. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Israel's former Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, and I started by asking him whether Israel and the US had just embarked on a potentially lengthy war with unforeseen consequences.
No, what we've done is prevented a much worse situation a year or two down the road, where we'd have a nuclear Iran with thousands of ballistic missiles. So we're taking care of the problem early on so we don't meet that threat when it's unmanageable.
But Donald Trump declared in June that the Iranian nuclear program had been obliterated. This war shouldn't have been necessary if he was right then.
Well, that's because the Iranian regime decided to renew its efforts, and it's beginning to move some of its centrifuges under a mountain called Pickaxe Mountain, which is way deeper than Fordo, and it's immune to any bombing, even American bombs. So if we didn't act now, we wouldn't be able to act later.
But when Donald Trump describes this as an imminent threat, and Israel has said it's preemptive, I mean, when you look at the sort of relative firepower of Iran versus America and Israel, this is of questionable legality, isn't it?
Well, should we wait for it to become a huge bully that we can't deal with? You have to deal with the bully when you can, not when you can't.
No matter the consequences, because potentially you've unleashed chaos, civil war, you're trying to effect a regime change from the air, has that been done before?
No, what we're trying to do is prevent from a genocidal regime that explicitly says that it wants to annihilate my country. They say it. Kathy, they say it, for God's sake. And they're trying to acquire nuclear weapons. They're building more and more factories for ballistic missiles that reach London.
Donald Trump says he wants to topple the regime, though. Is that possible without sending in ground troops in the days and weeks to come?
Well, what we're doing is we're creating the conditions for the amazing Iranian people for them to decide. If they take to the streets, it's up to them to free themselves. We can't deliver them freedom. They have to deliver it to themselves. They have to claim it. And this is something, if you will, a gift of the Jewish nation to the Iranian nation. And we owe them some debt from 2,500 years ago, by the way.
And what if they don't rise up as you want them to? What happens then? What's the plan B?
The plan B is for Iran to totally dismantle its nuclear program. Look, there are many, many countries around the world that are peaceful, that they focus on building their own country. Your own country, our country. No one wakes up in the morning and says, we want to annihilate another country. Oh, and by the way, we're trying to acquire nuclear weapons. Iran is doing that. If they decide tomorrow morning or 10 minutes from now that they just want to go on with their own business and stop wreaking havoc across the Middle East, this whole thing goes away.
So you hope to bomb them back to the negotiating table?
No, we hope for them to decide that enough is enough, that if they continue to pursue the nuclear weapon aspect, they'll be hit again and again until they fall.
Iran has already begun fighting back. Isn't the lesson from Iraq, from Libya, from Syria, that what follows is chaos, potentially civil war?
It depends. Here, our goal is really simple. Our goal is for them to give up their nuclear ambitions and not develop thousands of missiles that'll kill my family. And by the way, they're shooting at UAE, at Qatar, at Bahrain, and all across the Middle East. None of them may hit Iran, because this is a terror regime. And all it does, the regime, not the people, all it does every day is conduct terror across the world. It's got to stop.
How much of this is about politics and Benjamin Netanyahu's calculation that with general election looming, that he will be politically strengthened by this action?
No, this is about the future of my children, the future of a peaceful Middle East. Look, I am Netanyahu's primary opponent. I'm the guy running against Netanyahu. And I'm saying, as his primary opponent, that this action is absolutely right. This action is long due. I've been calling for this for a decade, to hit the octopus head of terror on its epicenter. And that's what we're doing right now. We all stand behind this.
Naftali Bennett, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, reaction across Europe has varied. President Macron said France stood by its allies and warned Iran it must stop its nuclear and missile programs. But the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez criticised the US and Israeli action, calling for immediate de-escalation and full respect for international law. Sir Keir Starmer addressed the nation earlier, confirming that Britain played no role in the strikes, but warning that Iran must never be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. He said that British planes were flying in the Middle East for defensive operations to protect our people, our interests and our allies.
the United Kingdom played no role in these strikes. But we have long been clear. The regime in Iran is utterly abhorrent. They have murdered thousands of their own people, brutally crushed dissent, and sought to destabilize the region. Even in the United Kingdom, the Iranian regime poses a direct threat to dissidents and to the Jewish community.
Well, joining me now is Sir Richard Dalton, who's a former British ambassador to Iran. Sir Richard, is this looking like a rerun of the Iraq war, potentially worse, another forever war?
Not necessarily. It could be that the overwhelming force being brought to bear will bring it to an end shortly. But there is one aspect, which is the predominance of lies and exaggerations in the justification given by the aggressor. There is absolutely no evidence of a current nuclear weapons program. Netanyahu has been saying since the late 1990s that Iran was within months of having a nuclear weapon, and it remains as untrue today as it did then. So I challenge those who say that Iran is lying about this to show the evidence that they have. This is simply currently an excuse.
So what is your judgment then of the legality of this action?
It is undoubtedly an illegal aggression. It is a crime. The abhorrent nature of the Iranian government does not justify a slaughter on this scale or an attempt to extinguish the independence and sovereignty of a member state. Moreover, it flies in the face of the rules and laws laid down as a consequence of the appalling breakdown of international order in the 20th century and the sacrifices of our fathers and grandfathers to try and establish that nations have rights not to be exposed to the arbitrary use of force to resolve disputes, that should be respected. I don't want to live in a world in which the only rule is a rule that the strong men, whether Russia or the United States, can make up the rules as they go along.
But you heard what I put a similar argument to the Israeli former Prime Minister, and you heard him talking about the genocidal threat from Iran. Doesn't that carry weight?
There is no current genocidal capability in Iran, and there is no such threat. Indeed, it's very unwise of Mr. Bennett to throw around the word of genocide when so many international experts on that subject say that genocide is what they are doing. We are in an era in which the imperialism of the United States has gone rogue, and it's time to see whether what Mr. Carney called for, namely middle powers to stand against it, to see whether that has got any strength to it. Unfortunately, what is...
I just wonder what you made of the statement from the Saudis today, effectively, condemning the blatant attacks by Iran. That support for what Donald Trump's doing is significant, isn't it?
Well, is it support for what Donald Trump is doing? I haven't seen evidence of that. And of course, they would condemn attacks on their soil, albeit that the intention of the attacks appears in some cases to have been American facilities.
I mean, there was no condemnation of the US action, though, from Saudi, which was interesting, wasn't it?
Well, the United States bully has established a kind of hegemony over the opinions of states. So we hear the British Prime Minister, who started in a neutral position, now saying that it's down to Iran to end an aggression against it. I mean, that is simply absurd and the most appalling hypocrisy, given the stance we take against aggressors elsewhere.
What did you make of Keir Starmer's response then? Does the UK inevitably get drawn into this? Because he was emphasising the need to stop further escalation, respect for international law and so on. Does the UK get drawn into this, not least because Trump may need to use the UK-US base in Diego Garcia?
Well, they certainly shouldn't make the United Kingdom complicit in their aggression. We'll know more about the international diplomatic response when we see the results, if any, of the UN Security Council meeting, and we will see whether this
alleged interest of the British government in international law means anything in practice. They should be calling for a ceasefire, as the UN Secretary General has done.
The joint American-Israeli strikes in Iran may have been precipitated by a staggering buildup of force in the region, but its roots go back more than just a few weeks. Iran has been a thorn in the side of the United States for decades, raging against the great Satan that once helped orchestrate a coup against its leaders. Just a few months ago, Donald Trump launched an attack that he said obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities. So why have they attacked again? Kemian Zeram reports.
America's relationship with Iran had been tense for decades before the hostage crisis which came to define their bitter feud. The failed rescue mission of 52 embassy staff abducted during the 1979 revolution. Helicopters lying wrecked in the desert after poor planning and mechanical failure. 8 US soldiers killed in the confusion. By the time the hostages were eventually returned, the pattern had been set. Iran's Islamic leadership implacably opposed to a US-centric worldview, determined to use its own influence to build an Islamic republic at the heart of the Middle East, and pursuing nuclear energy as a matter of national pride and security. But nuclear bombs, feared Washington, were Iran's real ambition, which Iran has denied all along. And thus we arrive at today. The US and its allies say Iran's support of allied militias across the region, what Tehran calls the axis of resistance, fuels instability and political violence. From Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria to Shia militias in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen. Iran sponsoring what the West calls terror and its nuclear program, both issues always near the top of the global diplomatic in-tray. President Obama reached a deal that supposedly limited enrichment with the Iranian President Rouhani.
The two of us discussed our ongoing efforts to reach an agreement over Iran's nuclear program.
Only to be torn up by Trump during his first term in favor of sanctions.
We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction.
October the 7th then unleashed change not just in Gaza, but across the entire region. Israel went after Hamas. Gaza destroyed, tens of thousands killed. Hamas still in charge, but weakened. Likewise, Hezbollah in Lebanon, whose leadership was decapitated and firepower degraded after pages were booby-trapped and a relentless bombing campaign. The axis of resistance was collapsing. As for Iran itself, Israel launched the 12-day war last summer, which many say bumped Trump into attacking the country's nuclear facilities in Operation Midnight Hammer.
They were decimated. Their nuclear capability, that potential which could have happened within 3 or 4 weeks, was decimated. It's been obliterated.
Since then, Washington deployed a huge armada, Trump's goal expanding from stopping an Iranian nuke to regime change. During widespread protests a few weeks ago, the US promised the demonstrators help was on its way. But the mullahs and Revolutionary Guard are in total control of internal security. Human rights groups say 30,000 were killed for daring to protest. Last week in Geneva, more nuclear talks ended without agreement. And this morning, the US moved again, backed by Israel, without congressional or UN agreement and no apparent basis in international law. President Trump claiming again the US was paving the way for Iranians to rise up.
When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take.
US-backed regime change doesn't have a great record. What's going to happen in Iran?
There's just no successful track record. I mean, this is the United States, yes, has a powerful, mighty army with a lot of hammers in its toolbox. And if the problem is a nail, you can use a hammer. But if the problem is not a nail, it doesn't matter how many hammers, midnight or daytime hammers, you try to use for this problem.
What happens now? Iran is facing an uncertain and scary future.
Well, the strikes on Iran prompted protests in London against Iran's government. Waving the Lion and Sun pre-1979 Islamic Revolution flag, many were chanting in favour of Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of Iran's last Shah. People also rode on the back of motorbikes through the streets of London, waving the same flag. Pahlavi has urged people inside Iran to stay in their homes for now and return to the streets when he tells them. Well, joining me now from Geneva, where talks between Iran and the US had been taking place, is Ali Vaez, Director of Crisis Group's Iran Project. Ali Vaez, how devastating do you think these attacks are for the Iranian regime, but of course also the Iranian people?
These are very serious attacks on the Iranian regime. If in the 12-day war, the US used the hammer, it is using a juggernaut now. And it is going for the Iranian regime's jugular. It is trying to do political decapitation. It is trying to destroy command and control. It is trying to degrade the regime's repressive capacity. This is the most serious threat the regime has ever faced.
And of course, we've seen a lot of fatalities across Iran. Will people blame the Iranian regime for what's happening or the US?
Look, the Iranian regime is very much detested within the population, but we don't know what would be the balance of blame here. Because after the protests last month when the regime committed the massacre, there were a lot of Iranians who actually wanted foreign military intervention. But we don't know what percentage of the Iranian society was comprised of people like that. And we don't know if casualty numbers start mounting up, if the country's infrastructure is targeted, if people's level of misery goes through the roof, then what would be the balance of blame? But of course, we've seen this in the past, that the US is very good at tactical victories in conflicts like this. It doesn't necessarily win the battles of hearts and minds.
Well, and Trump's called for the people to rise up and overthrow the regime. How does this regime fall? How does that come about? What's the machinery that makes that possible?
Look, it's very hard to imagine that that scenario would pan out. The US can, for sure, degrade the Iranian regime, remove several layers of it. But the repressive apparatus of this regime is comprised of literally hundreds of thousands of revolutionary guards and their militia. And the massacre they committed last month was with small arms. This is not Syria, in which fighter jets and tanks and barrel bombs and chemical weapons were used. So in order to completely neutralize the repressive capacity of this regime, it requires literally weeks and months of massive bombardments, which would create massive casualties. And even then, the people who are supposed to take over are unarmed, unorganized, fragmented, and don't have leadership and infrastructure to be able to take over the task of governance.
And when the US removed Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, obviously a very different scenario, a very different country, but they installed Delcy Rodriguez. Who is the equivalent in Iran? Is there one? Does the US have someone in mind?
That might be the case, but I think the main difference with Venezuela here is that the negotiations that led to that kind of transition happened before the military operation. Now the US has put the cart before the horse. It is trying to kill every senior Iranian official out there. So it is not clear how it will be able to negotiate with the remnants of this regime and whether they would actually trust the United States. Remember that President Trump reneged on an agreement with Iran, as your reporter was explaining, in 2018, and also bombed Iran twice in the course of less than a year in the middle of negotiations. So it's hard to trust him as a reliable negotiating partner.
And, you know, we know from previous experience in Iraq and so on what chaos this can unleash in Iran itself, but also in the region. And Iran's now launched these retaliatory strikes. How much chaos can this now unleash, do you think?
A lot more. This is just day one, and this could really result in a full regional conflagration. And if the US succeeds in bringing down the Iranian regime, it might replace it with a more radicalized one, or it might replace it with chaos and civil strife, turning a country of 92 million into a failed state, which would have consequences like radicalization, instability, wave of refugees that would affect not just the region, but it would also reach European shores.
Ali Vaez, thank you very much for joining us. Well, the strikes have had a major impact across the Gulf. Qatar has just suspended all public events and gatherings and hotels and tourism sites until further notice. And in the United Arab Emirates, text messages have been sent to citizens and residents telling them to remain indoors and await official instructions. Well, let's bring in our US editor, Anushka Astana, in Washington again. Anushka.
I think the question here is, what is the end game? If, as the mood music suggests, the end game is regime change, then the question you've been asking, Kathy, can it actually be achieved from the air? Speaking to people who have been involved in these discussions under previous presidents, they came to the conclusion that no, it couldn't, that it would require a more protracted operation and that was too high risk. And I actually think that the British view echoes some of that. It's interesting listening to the language from Keir Starmer. Officials in the UK government tell me that he's being very careful. He's walking a diplomatic tightrope, in part because he doesn't want to criticise the US. He wants to make clear we oppose the Iranian regime, but also we do not support regime change for a couple of reasons. Sources say, firstly, there is no credible opposition, and secondly, we're worried about the impact of this. There is talk here about the fear of terror reprisals. Well, sources in the UK say it is no coincidence that the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, turned up at Cobra this morning, and also worries about what happens if they close the Strait of Hormuz, and that impacts global oil supplies and, in turn, affects inflation.
And we've had a statement from US Central Command saying that the damage to American interests has been minimal so far. But how do you think all of this will go down with Americans?
Well, look, Donald Trump has been monitoring this overnight, actually from Florida, from Mar-a-Lago. He spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, spoke to the so-called Gang of Eight, the key figures in Congress before this happened. They didn't do that from Venezuela, so they've learnt their lesson. That said, they did not get congressional permission to do this, and there is annoyance about that in Congress. Republicans did not vote this week to try to restrain Donald Trump's war powers, but they are nervous about the midterms in November. They're nervous because they know that Americans, while they might accept strikes on Iran, they told me this week, MAGA-supporting, Trump-supporting Americans have told me they do not want a long war in Iran.